Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on our last panel of the day. We're very, very excited to welcome Yuriko Cowper-Smith, Tyler Valiquette, I apologize, and Yvonne for their panel on Displaced and in the Dark, Protecting LGBTQI plus asylum seekers during a pandemic. Thank you so much, and I apologize, Tyler, for mispronouncing your last name, but we're very excited to have all of you here. So I'll let you get started.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yuriko Cowper-Smith, and I'm a colleague of Tyler and Yvonne. I'm a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Guelph. My PhD research looks at the Rohingya social movement in Canada, which is a diaspora-led movement countering genocide and displacement. I joined this project, which Tyler will explain a bit further, in the spring of this year, right around the time when COVID really ramped up around the world. So I'll pass it to Tyler.
Thanks, Yuriko. Hi, everyone. My name's Tyler Valiquette. I'm currently based in Brazil. I'm a lecturer and researcher at the University of Brasilia. And my research focuses on the politics of homophobia in Brazil, LGBT rights, LGBT anti-discrimination law, and more recently, I've been focusing on Venezuelan LGBT asylum seekers in Brazil. And our other panelist today is Yvonne. She's actually not joining us, but Yvonne is a prof at York University in equity studies, and she's been supporting us with this research as well. So I'm going to get us started. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So as it stands, the literature on queer rights activism has greatly expanded across various disciplines. However, there remains very little written on queer rights activism in the Global South, particularly when examining South-to-South queer migration. So in particular, forced migration literature remains underdeveloped in understanding how LGBTQI asylum seekers and their support networks in countries of resettlement come together to confront these challenges and to confront these barriers. So this is really evident during the COVID-19 pandemic, as asylum seekers often remain trapped between borders and left vulnerable to the virus, which really highlights the inequities that exist. So our research focuses on one such example, which is the queer rights activism that is being done at Casa Amiga, which is the only LGBTQI-led refugee center in Brazil and one of the few in Latin America. So as borders close, how are LGBTQI asylum seekers faring? What can we learn from this pandemic regarding South-to-South LGBTQI migration and activism? And our paper argues that the threats faced by gender and sexual minority populations like LGBTQI asylum seekers in Brazil are heightened by the pandemic, and the importance of grassroots organizers and organizations on the front lines are attempting to resist the inequities that LGBTQI asylum seekers must contend with. So we can go to the next slide. Thank you so much. So Brazil has been recognized as a leader for LGBTQI rights and refugee resettlement in Latin America. And it's also home to some of the region's most advanced laws when it comes to women, LGBTQI folks, and refugee rights. But paradoxically, there exists significant anti-gender, anti-gay, and national rhetoric that makes Brazil a rather hostile country for women, minority groups, the LGBT community, and refugees in general. So these political tensions and social inequalities have become exacerbated during the pandemic and made worse by the inadequate response by the government. So currently, Brazil has the third most COVID cases and the second highest number of deaths globally. And LGBTQI asylum seekers are heavily affected, yet largely ignored during the pandemic due to the government's lack of attention to the needs of vulnerable communities, including LGBTQI people, and particularly asylum seekers. So with their legal statuses in limbo, LGBTQI asylum seekers are left with very few resources to actually address their needs during the pandemic. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So in terms of our methods, for this research project, we partnered with Casamiga, and as I said, it's the only LGBTQI refugee center in Brazil, one of the few in Latin America. Casamiga is located in Manaus, and Manaus is a city in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. It's known as the heart of the Amazon, and it's one of the major hubs for asylum seekers coming from Venezuela. Asylum seekers coming from Venezuela view Manaus as a land of opportunity, as it's one of the big economic hubs of the north and central part of the country. We were the first foreign researchers granted access to Casamiga, and we're very fortunate for that because given their intersectional identities, the residents of Casamiga face multiple forms of violence. So it's really important to adhere to their safety protocols and keep the identities of the interviewees safe and secret. Our research was approved through the University of Brasilia. As I mentioned, I teach and I do research based out of the University of Brasilia, and it's through my networks here in Brazil and at the university that I was introduced to UN staff members, as well as the leader of Manifesta LGBT, which is a large LGBT charity that helped found Casamiga. So in total, we conducted 26 semi-structured interviews, 16 of which were with Venezuelan LGBTQI asylum seekers. 10 were with service providers and politicians. So we were able to interview politicians from every level of government, municipal, state, and federal, as well as the head of CANARE, which is a government committee responsible for reviewing and deciding all asylum claims in Brazil. In addition, we conducted 8 of our interviews with asylum seekers in November of 2019, so about a year ago. And since then, we've interviewed 8 other asylum seekers in May and June of this year, kind of on the onset of the pandemic. We did that through mainly Zoom and phone calls. So I'm going to pass it over to Yuriko, and we can hit the next slide.
Thank you, Tyler. So from our analysis, we established 4 main findings, and I'll go through these in a bit more detail. So the first one is that asylum seekers faced violence, xenophobia, and discrimination before COVID. So all 16 asylum seekers experienced physical violence in Brazil, and they believe that they were the victims of this violence because of their sexual and gender identities. Violence ranged from homophobic slurs to public beatings to head shavings by local people to police brutality. Our research also revealed in the same theme that trans asylum seekers face even more challenges than other asylum seekers of the LGBTQ community. So of the 16 interviewees, 4 identified as trans, and all of them highlighted instances of violence explicitly linked to their trans identities. So the staff at Casamiga agreed, asserting that trans asylum seekers are also often targets of human trafficking. Beyond physical violence, the asylum seekers that we interviewed also expressed that they faced xenophobia and discrimination due to their identities as both Venezuelan and LGBT. So one asylum seeker stated, for example, we were, quote, "we were exploited because we are Venezuelan refugees," end quote. So all interviewees stated that they had found it either difficult or impossible to find stable employment. So the asylum seekers discussed taking informal jobs such as selling water, making handicrafts, or working temporarily in restaurants or bars for little or no pay. And so many of them expressed that they felt unwelcomed in Manaus and by the local population where they worked. So on the second finding, COVID exacerbated these challenges that are faced by LGBTQI asylum seekers. So during the pandemic, 5 of the asylum seekers noted that fake news stories on social media claiming that LGBTQI people spread COVID made them fear even more for their physical safety, even more so than before. Another finding along this topic is that interviewees' mental health was also strained by the repercussions of the pandemic. So they emphasized that their lives had become even more precarious, and that they felt increased anxiety about finding work and settling in Brazil. All of them had lost these informal types of jobs that they had found. And they also could no longer access the emergency fund that was supposed to help people who were laid off. And their other income sources also dried up. Asylum seekers at the same time lost access to essential services like healthcare. They felt that they had, for this reason, they felt that they had very little support from the government. And they stressed that the government wasn't even doing enough for the Brazilian population, let alone asylum seekers. So 4 of the interviewees revealed that this pandemic made them feel like they were frozen, because the main refugee processing center or determination center halted processing. And so as one interviewee shared, quote, "Those of us who live in refugee shelters see it as temporary. We have hope that we will leave and begin to have a more normal life. COVID has erased that hope. We don't know what is happening," end quote. So on the third main finding, we recognize that COVID also leads to new threats of violence and discrimination for the LGBTQI asylum seekers. As I noted earlier, the asylum seekers are always at the risk of violence and discrimination. However, also as Tyler mentioned, during the pandemic, when mobility and freedom are limited, the asylum seekers are at even greater risk, especially when they were in other shelters, not in Casamiga. So the manager of Casamiga pointed out that, quote, "It is because these people are together for 24 hours. They are forced to be together for long periods in high levels of stress with very little privacy or ability to hide their identity, sexuality and gender identity. When these things are revealed, they are often expelled during the pandemic, and so prejudice is stronger than ever," end quote. So since the start of the pandemic, Casamiga has only been able to take in 3 emergency cases, and they've come to the shelter after being outed for their sexuality or gender identity. And so they face physical threats to their safety at these other shelters. So the LGBTQI asylum seekers who access Casamiga at this time really needed an LGBTQI friendly space for protection due to the lack of privacy that they were facing in the other shelters and what led to their expulsion from those shelters. So our last main finding, and perhaps most importantly, is that Casamiga is a place of support. So despite the new risks and challenges of COVID, all of the asylum seekers stated that they prefer to live at Casamiga rather than these other shelters. As residents at Casamiga is temporary, and many of the asylum seekers expressed that they would, when they're required to leave, they would rather live on the street than face violence or discrimination at another refugee shelter. So that's a really drastic point that shows how important Casamiga is to them. And they further expressed 2 reasons why they want to stay at Casamiga. And so first, Casamiga offers, like I mentioned, this protection based on their LGBTQI identity, and they seek safety from the violence and discrimination, xenophobia, and transphobia. And second, they're able to build a community at Casamiga. Some of the interviewees expressed that they had hidden their identities, their sexualities and their identities before, when they were still in Venezuela. And when they came to Brazil and they lived at Casamiga, they were able to start exploring their sexuality and their gender identity in this safe space. So in summary, these main findings show that Casamiga, as Tyler mentioned, is at the forefront of providing services and advocating for LGBTQI asylum seekers and refugees from another country in the global south. And if we can go to the next slide, I'll conclude with some observations. So we make 4 concluding observations from our work. From this case, by mapping out the challenges that asylum seekers at Casamiga face, and by analyzing how Casamiga has responded to these precarious and inequitable conditions, our research really illuminates that this refugee center is a vital feature of the resettlement landscape. So we learned that Casamiga plays this crucial role in mitigating violence and discrimination experienced by the asylum seekers within, as Tyler mentioned, the constraints of a homophobic and xenophobic society. So places like Casamiga need support during, well, in normal times, but especially during the pandemic. So we just want to end by highlighting that it's very important to study this work because they're doing some of the most productive things to protect minorities and to instate their rights, especially during the pandemic. So although Casamiga lacks support from the government, from international organizations and other non-governmental organizations, it's trying to survive on its own. And without places like Casamiga, gender and sexual minorities are left in the dark with no choice but to survive in the main camps or, as they mentioned, in the streets. And that is the conclusion of our presentation.
Thank you so much, Tyler and Yuriko, for that deeply important and difficult presentation. Thank you for sharing your insights. And we're very sad that Dr. Yvonne was not able to make it. But nonetheless, it was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. We'll begin the live Q&A. So we'll just wait a few minutes just to let the other presenters join and then to let other audience members and viewers join. I've collected a number of questions for your presentation that just occurred, but also the other ones that have been taking place throughout the day. So we'll just go in order of the presentations as they happened, but I think we'll wait a couple of minutes to let folks trickle in and then we'll begin. So yeah, thank you for your presentation. So.